Once upon a time, not in your time, not in my time, but in the old time, when the earth and the sea were new, when wishing still helped, people told stories. They told them then, and they still tell them now. We use stories to structure our lives and determine meaning. Parables in the Bible teach Christians how to live. Aesop's fables, such as the tortoise and the hare, teach a lesson about perseverance and hard work. The tortoise and hare race, but the slower tortoise wins because he doesn't stop to rest. There's even a tidy little moral at the end. Slow and steady wins the race. Or maybe your translation says, the race is not always to the swift. The morals of fairy tales are not always so obvious, but they tell us how to behave, to be patient in the face of adversity, to be kind to strangers and the poor, to be polite to old women who might be fairies in disguise, and that even if we sleep for 100 years, someone will rescue us. We may no longer listen to fairy tales around a fire, but we are still haunted by stories. We watch them on Netflix and Amazon Prime. We obsessively share tropes and memes with our friends on social media. We are, as a species, addicted to story. Even when the body goes to sleep at night, the mind stays up telling itself stories. Stories rewire our brain. Neuroscientists tell us that when we listen to a well-told story, the same areas of the brain light up on an MRI in both the storyteller and the listener. Your brain, as the listener, mirrors the brain of the storyteller. In other words, when you hear a well-told story, your brain reacts as if you were experiencing it yourself. Your brain places you inside the story. Today, I'm going to talk about Agile user stories, how they relate to the structure of the folktale, and how we can use that understanding to better understand the structure of documentation. Computer science is beginning to understand the importance of stories and has begun to apply them to product design. Agile uses the concept of user stories as a way for developers to plan and write the code that they use to create products. And we're beginning to also center our documentation around them. But developers frequently don't craft their user stories carefully because they just want to get something done, and the user experience of the product suffers. If you aren't already familiar with user stories, let me give you a quick definition. A really good user story has a specific structure. It identifies who the user is, what they need, and for what purpose, the why. Such stories are written in this format. As a type of user, I want some feature so that I can accomplish some task. Here's an example of a user story that clearly defines the who, what, and why. As a student, I want to buy my books before my classes start so that I don't start the semester behind. Here are some more user stories. As a Facebook user, I want to be able to send a private message to a friend so that I don't hurt anyone's feelings. As a systems administrator, I want to upgrade the computer cluster while the system is running so that my company doesn't have any downtime. The who in a user story is typically a persona, someone who embodies the needs and behaviors of a hypothetical user. The what in a user story details in specific terms the need, feature, or function desired by the who. This is what your project team will build into the product or service. The why in a user story states the value. It presents the needs of your users and customers up front and center. The why is the most important part of a user story, and the why is what separates a good user story from a bad one. The why should never be something like, so that the sysadmin can read the OpenShift console. For example, that why is actually just how the system works and has nothing to do with the intents of the user. In Agile, all of these user stories are then combined to form an epic, which is a set of user stories that accomplish a larger outcome. User stories were originally designed as a way to develop software products. But in my department, Customer Content Services, we have started using user stories like these as a way to create documentation that maps better to the needs of our customers. If we understand their tasks and put our minds in their mindset, we can create documentation that actually helps them and meets them where they need our help. Each user story becomes a procedure, or sometimes a set of procedures. The Agile Epic can then become a user guide. Let me show you how to use a user story as a template for procedures in user documentation. I'm going to start with some user stories used to document Red Hat OpenShift. Before we go into a lot of detail, I need to give you a little background about OpenShift so that you can understand these user stories a little better. OpenShift is a complicated product, but in very simple terms, it allows system administrators and developers to manage cloud workloads and containers. A cluster is a set of machines that runs and manages containers. Here are some excellent user stories from a section on troubleshooting problems with OpenShift clusters. The first user story is this one. As a cluster administrator, I want to review the status of my cluster so that I can find the problem areas. A second user story that's related is, as a cluster administrator, I want to know how to collect relevant OpenShift debug data efficiently so that we can diagnose the problem quickly. And here's one more user story that focuses on the business impact. As a cluster administrator, I want to resolve OpenShift issues quickly so that their impact on our business is minimized. Notice how these user stories focus on the why. The cluster admin wants to find problem areas, debug quickly, and make sure that the business can keep going no matter what. This is the way a real person thinks. These are the anxieties that plague a sysadmin's life. Let's take a look at a single one of these user stories. As a cluster administrator, I want to know how to collect relevant OpenShift debug data efficiently so that diagnosis can proceed quickly. The story ended up becoming a collection of procedures because there are actually multiple ways to collect the debug data. Here's what the final collection of procedures looks like. The overall mega procedure, which is based on the user story, is gathering data about your cluster. It's circled in red. The sub-procedures are things like gathering data about your cluster for Red Hat support, gathering data about specific features, querying different logs to get more cluster data, collecting a network trace, passing this information on to Red Hat support in the most efficient way. If we drill down into one of these procedures, gathering data about your cluster for Red Hat support, you can see how it's very focused on what the customer needs to do to quickly complete the task and get back to work. These are simple, clear instructions with enough context so that the readers know the reasons for their actions. This way of using user stories to design your documentation creates better content. You get instructions that are tightly focused on helping the user. Now, let's come back to folklore for just a second. We've talked about how important stories are to the human brain, and now we've discussed user stories and how we use them in documentation. When you start thinking about the connections between Agile user stories and stories in general, you can begin to see a book like Grimm's Fairy Tales in a new way. It's more than a collection of unrelated stories. The way that humans use stories is bigger than that. It's bigger than that simple thought. And these stories belong together. Instead, it's a collection of user stories for German culture. In the early 1800s, Germans told these stories, not just for entertainment, but to transmit their culture and their values. These were not only children's tales, they were teaching tales for all ages. They encouraged particular, frequently virtuous behavior. Far from writing a children's book, the Grimms collected these stories to establish a German national identity. A really good user story ought to be a really good story like these folk tales, which we can still tell from memory many years after we first heard them. Just as a good user story and a good epic have a set structure, folk tales tend to be very similar. All stories fall into a small set of categories because our brains thrive on predictable narrative structures. A number of folklorists and English professors have studied this and come up with many different ideas of what that set structure is. But regardless of how you look at it, it's true. Certain elements and structures are repeated and you can catalog them. A folk tale has archetypal characters, princes and princesses, youngest sons, evil stepmothers, wicked fairies, cunning spiders. In an oral tradition, archetypal characters are easier to remember and their stories are easier to transmit. But in addition, archetypal characters allow the listeners or the readers to put themselves into the story and live it as if they were the protagonist. Archetypal characters in folktales are the same as user personas in user experience design and agile user stories. When you start to really look at both folklore and documentation, you can begin to see how one can easily translate into the other. The archetypal characters of the folklore, the third sons, wicked queens, and virtuous heroes and heroines, are just an earlier version of the personas that we use to write documentation and design software. The folktale plot elements, which I will go into more detail about in a minute, are the user stories. The overall folktale is the same as an agile epic. You probably are already familiar with a number of famous folk stories. Hansel and Gretel, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, Rumpelstiltskin, The Three Little Pigs. You may even know the versions of the stories that have not been made into Disney movies. Let me tell you two stories, both from the Brothers Grimm, but not really very well known, rarely told together and not collected at the same time. The first is number 17 from Grimm's Tales, The White Snake. Once upon a time, long ago, there lived a king who was famed for his wisdom. Nothing remained hidden from him. This king had a trusted servant. Every day this servant brought one extra covered dish to his table after everyone else was gone. The servant's curiosity became too much for him, and he opened the dish. Upon the platter was a white snake. The servant was quickly overcome by a desire to taste the snake, and he took a bite. Suddenly he could understand the speech of the animals. Now this servant longed to see the world, and he took a horse and rode off for an adventure. One day he was passing a pond, and he heard 3 fishes stuck in the rushes and gasping for water. He rescued them, and they promised to be ever grateful. Next he rescued an ant king, who now also owed him a favor. And finally he rescued 3 baby ravens who were starving. Once all these animals owed him their lives, the trusted servant was able to perform 2 difficult tasks for the king, who promised him his beautiful daughter. To begin with, the fish helped him to retrieve a gold ring from the bottom of a pond. Then the ants helped him gather grains of millet. The king promised that the servant could wed the princess, but the princess did not love him and did not want to marry beneath her. The 3 ravens brought the servant a golden apple. He and the princess ate the apple together. Her heart was filled with love for him, and they lived to a ripe old age in perfect happiness. This is a story that not a lot of people have heard before, but it does have a lot of components and story structures that are common to all folk tales. I'm going to quickly summarize another story from the Brothers Grimm. This one is a story of three brothers. The two older brothers are lazy and selfish, and the younger brother is kind and thoughtful, but not very smart. His name is Blockhead. Blockhead won't let his older brothers molest the animals that they meet. He accomplishes his 3 tasks with the help of those animals and is rescued by the queen bee. He marries the princess and lives happily ever after. These are 2 different stories, not picked quite at random, but not selected to be similar. They just are similar, like most folktales are. The white snake and the queen bee have archetypal characters, personas, just like any folktale. The wise king, the trusted servant, the beautiful princess, the 3 brothers with the 2 lazy older brothers, and the youngest brother who is the hero. Both stories have helpful talking animals. They also have similar plot points that make them predictable narratives. The servant gains a special skill, which allows him to help 3 animals. The servant completes 3 tasks. The rescued animals help the servant. Blockhead is kind to 3 animals. He also completes 3 tasks, and the animals also help him. Both Blockhead and the trusted servant marry the princess. Let's also spend a minute and think of the user stories for the white snake. The main persona is the trusted servant. He is the protagonist. This is one of his user stories. As a trusted servant, I want to know the king's secret so that I can become wise too. The overarching user story of the white snake is probably even a little more nuanced. As a trusted servant, I want to complete these quests so that I can marry the princess and live happily ever after. Folklore is different from computer science and technical documentation, but like these stories, it's also a discipline from which we can learn a lot. The folktale has been studied by many different researchers, and I have tried to synthesize their different ideas to put this talk together. If you want to research the information in this talk more, I took some of my content from The Structuralism of Claude Lévi-Strauss, The Folktale Typing of Stith Thompson and Antti Arn, The Folktale Analysis of the Russian folklorist Vladimir Prop, and The Concept of the Hero's Journey from Joseph Campbell. By studying what these people have had to say about the role of the story and the folktale in our lives, we can better understand the world around us and the work that we do. In the next part of my talk, I'll compare folktale structure to the structure of what developers and sysadmins do in more detail. The structure of Red Hat's documentation mirrors the structure of folktales. The structure of folktales can become a stand-in for our customers' lives. First, I want to talk briefly about the software development lifecycle. Start at the middle of this graphic. Developing software that provides a solution is the goal of the software development lifecycle. So development is the oval at the middle. First, the developers plan and design. Then they build. And finally, they maintain their software. Then they start the cycle again as they plan enhancements and upgrades to an initial piece of software. The software development lifecycle never really ends. The jobs of troubleshooting, testing, and verifying are also part of the lifecycle, but they run through all parts of it. Now, I want you to bend your brain a little and think of the hero's journey as if it were a software development lifecycle. It has the same predictable narrative structures that the software development lifecycle does, but the names are a little different. The hero has a goal in the middle of the chart, and to reach that goal, the hero's journey has a beginning, middle, and end. Although the story never really ends, a new story begins on the other side of happily ever after. So like the software development lifecycle, it's a circle. The beginning of the story establishes the setting, characters, situation, and any warnings or cautions. The hero may violate a prohibition. In the middle of the story, The hero goes on quests, finds objects, solves puzzles, overcomes antagonists and obstacles. Heroes may need assistance and guidance. In the final phase, the hero returns, rescues, outwits, solves the puzzle, and marries the prince or princess. Now let's merge the software life cycle and the hero's life cycle. But now the hero is a typical Red Hat persona, the developer. The developer's goal is developing software. First, they plan and design, then they build, and then they maintain. I've listed the jobs that they do in each of these stages, and these jobs can become the tasks that you actually document. This is a powerful way to view your documentation. Your writing then becomes easier because you know what the pieces are. Even more importantly, your readers know what to expect from you. I want to emphasize too that I've presented this documentation as a cycle. We write in outlines as if everything is complete at the end of every procedure. In reality, even when developers complete a piece of software, they are never really done. Now here is the administrator's life cycle. Very similar tasks, but somewhat different. Very much like the white snake and the queen bee are both different and the same. When you look at the planning documentation for our system administrators, you'll see these common titles and tasks: understanding, introducing, designing, architecting, getting started, sizing, preparing, scoping, and release notes that tell you what's changed since the last version. Here's an example from the planning part of the customer journey. This is from the guide where our sysadmins are planning their Red Hat Enterprise Linux 8 installation. Before anything else, they have to prepare, review, and determine the best installation method for their environment. Check your system requirements. Download the ISO. Create a bootable installation medium. These are all preparatory steps and are part of the planning part of the journey. Deployment guides are the middle part of the administrator's journey, where the systems admin is on a quest to solve impossible installation puzzles and get the system up and running. Here's an example of the documentation for the deployment part of this journey. In this case, the customer is installing OpenShift Container Platform. Finally, the system has been planned and deployed. Now the system admin is ready for the journey home. In this part of the journey, he will monitor, analyze, optimize, tune, upgrade, patch, and backup. After the hard work of planning and deploying, the hero has gotten to the part of the story where they are ruling their kingdom. Unfortunately, you might also have disaster recovery in this phase. This piece of our documentation is part of the maintenance phase, where the sysadmin needs to recover from a server loss. In a way, this can be another trial that starts the story over. The tasks of the hero, the tasks of the developer, and the tasks of the administrator as they travel through the phases of their journeys are structured and predictable. The more that we recognize that structure and repetition, the better our documentation and the better our user stories. System administrators manage a collection of computer systems and data. Developers create products, but ultimately what they do is very much the same, and it's heroic. At the beginning, once upon a time, they plan. When it's time for a quest, they deploy and they build. And finally, when they return home and meet all their goals, they have achieved victory and maintain what they have built and created. Up until now, We've been discussing user stories and the structure of the folktale. Now let's consider the persona in some additional depth. Folklore can give us some great insights into personas and how to use them best when writing documentation. An actual persona might be more detailed, like this one, which was designed a few years ago by the talented individuals in Red Hat User Experience Design. This persona tells us a lot about John, the junior developer. We know his education, his background, the software that he knows, and more. We even now know that he prefers to arrive at work at 7 a.m. When user experience designers and marketing people create personas, they try to create a composite person that both feels like a real person and is representative of a group of people as a whole. A difficult balancing act. This level of detail can be important for developing marketing materials and designing product features, but our documentation doesn't really need that level of overkill. It's easier to keep a simpler, more iconic persona in your mind as you write documentation. I would argue that this is another place where we can really learn something from folklore. The personas and protagonists of folklore are extraordinarily simple. They are something that you can wrap your mind around, and also a place where listeners can put themselves into that mindset, which is exactly what we need to do as writers. We need to strongly empathize with our customers. We might want to read a detailed persona for background, but then focus on an iconic archetypal person as we work. An archetype can be better than a detailed representation. In folklore, we might have a princess in peril. The corresponding archetype in documentation could be the harried or desperate sysadmin. We might now have the clever programmer who can solve puzzles. The helpful fairy from folktales is supplanted by the helpful support engineer who is trying to soothe an upset customer. Here's a story that I want to tell you to think about all that underlies the importance of archetypes. One of my friends used to work with companies who would install system-wide software upgrades. She was once working at a client site as a computer consultant and had been there all weekend doing an installation and upgrade that had to be online first thing Monday morning. It was 3 a.m. on Sunday, and she was trying to solve an issue with her head slumped in her hands. She was exhausted, but still working feverishly. She told me recently, "When I write documentation, that is who I want to be writing to, me at 3 a.m. in the morning in that situation." That is an archetypal and iconic image, the exhausted computer consultant. Ultimately, it is more important to know the emotional state of the persona than whether they get to their desk at 7 a.m. Like any good folktale, parable, or fable, this talk has a moral. If we study folklore, we can see the world and our writing in a new and fresh way. Humans think in stories. We are compelled to tell them. Narrative structures our brains and our reality. Thinking about our readers and archetypes can help us write better stories for them. If we wrap stories around our technology, we can create more humane technology that serves us rather than ruling us. Our readers, customers, and users are the heroes of their own stories. They may not look like a dashing prince with a sword and shield. They may look just like you and me, but we need to see the hero in them and in all of us. Thank you.
All right. So to get into this Q&A, I want to start with, what is your background? Why folklore? Why do this comparison?
Oh, right. Well, I have an undergraduate degree in English and anthropology. It was a double major.
Mhm.
And I decided at some point to go on and try to get a master's degree in folklore. I was going to get a PhD
Cool.
originally, but that didn't work out. But I did finish my master's in folklore. And so I've studied all of this, Stith Thompson, Levi Strauss, all of that, Vladimir Prop. And I just started thinking about, what is it that I could present at a conference that would be kind of different and fun? And I started thinking about user stories and folklore and just the similarities. It just all started popping out to me. I mean, I've always been kind of a folklore enthusiast. Uh, you know, I think when I was 4, I had to be Cinderella every year. That was my first year for Halloween. And then like every year after year, I had to be Cinderella. So it kind of, the session started really early.
Yeah.
And then I do medieval and Renaissance reenacting. I'm a member of the SCA.
Cool.
So that's the other kind of a society of creative anachronisms. That's the other thread that goes into all of this.
That's great. But then how did you get from that to technical writing? When did that transition happen?
Well, it's really nice to be able to make a living. Sometimes
I mean, fair.
sometimes a master's in folklore is really just a license to beg for a living. Uh, the way I did it is when I finished my undergraduate degree, my one of my professors did technical writing as a side thing, and she said to me, Ingrid, would you like to come just be my assistant for a year? And so I became a mini Linda for a year, and that was where I got, and I just did everything for her, but she ended up teaching me how to do technical writing, and that was a stage before there were really degrees in technical communication.
Mm-hmm.
So that was how I learned. I learned on the job, and
That's great.
I really liked it. I just loved it. It was like, this is just a great thing to do. And then I moved into user experience and usability, which I loved even more than tech comm. So it kind of just kept snowballing. And eventually, I mean, I think people who've heard me speak before know that I spent several years homeschooling, but eventually I came back to tech comm, and it was like, this is even better than it was when I was doing it before. I'm really having an even
That's
better
great.
time.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's such a really, again, I feel like I say this like every other Q&A session, but I think everyone's background into technical writing is so interesting, but I think, this one might be the most. It's the most unexpected for me, and I think it's amazing. All right, I'm trying to think of what talk-related question to ask you first. We got a lot of chatter about your dress, so I mean, this is the first this isn't a question, but more of a comment. But your dress is great, and people have
Yeah,
been loving it.
it's a shout out to the kinds of blios that are popular. I guess they're really like, I think they're like 13th century with the long angel sleeves.
Mm-hmm.
They're a little. I actually don't have. I only have one outfit like this, but I actually found a modern equivalent, and I just loved it so much I had to buy it.
Yes, you also helped our somatic integrity, as I've been told in the chat, of making sure you had the same outfit, in your talk and afterwards. I think you're the first speaker to do it.
My husband worked as a videographer at one point, and he insisted. He said, "You got to go put on the same clothes," and I'm like, "Okay, if you think that people will like that."
Yes. Well, I at least know we have a few people who do. Okay, I will actually ask you some questions about your talk. So, like the first one, wondering. So, after everything, like, have you ever made a false assumption about exactly what kind of, or maybe how much information that users find useful? And
Oh yeah.
how did you deal with that?
Oh yeah. I mean, that's I think is just part of being a technical communicator, technical writer, is that we always make mistakes. I mean, we're human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the real problems is that even if you're very empathetic and you think of the customer, you think of the user all the time, that reader is not you. So even if I need the extra information, the person reading may not. And even if I don't need that information, the person reading may. Usually what I found out a lot of that when that's actually how I got into user experience, was that I started doing usability testing of my documentation and of the products that I was documenting. And that was when I really began to realize that the way I was documenting wasn't always optimal. And that, so that was how I really got interested in things like personas and just that kind of, how can you possibly get as close to the mindset of the user as you can? One of the things you can do is, it really depends on the size of your company. When in some of my initial documentation roles, I was in a very small company, and I had really easy access to my customer base. And so it's just real easy to go and test directly with them or talk to them or interview them. That was all really simple. Nowadays, it's not as easy, but I feel like because Red Hat is a lot bigger company than what I initially worked in. But you can go to the support people, you can go to the technical account managers, you can go to the people who do have that one-on-one contact. And in the case of the story that I told about the woman who was up all weekend, that's somebody who's a technical writer now, but started as a technical account manager, and so was on the customer sides and has that wonderful perspective on how much information is enough. You've got to trust other people, and you've got to realize you're going to make mistakes. It's part of being human.
Definitely. And then you touched on a lot of different ways to gather this kind of user information and intel. Do you have like any methods that you prefer, or you would say are the best for especially gaining like user needs or pain points?
Well, when I was doing user experience, my favorite thing to do was I'll just be honest with you. My favorite approach was contextual design, contextual inquiry and design, and that type of interview style where you go in and you follow people around while they're working and you interview them while they're working, but very much in their environment. Cool. That's my favorite. And, it probably comes from with an anthropology background and a folklore background. I spent a lot of time interviewing people and watching people in an environment. And to me, it seemed like this is the perfect way to do it, because people don't know what they want. They only know that something's wrong or that they want to do something. But frequently they want to do something they can't get there. And so what you do by watching them work is you get an idea for what their actual mindset is and where their real pain points are, as opposed to what you think they are. So so that's my favorite way to gather data, contextual inquiry and design. And it's, and I was trained full disclosure, I was trained by the people who do contextual design, spent a couple of years working as a contextual design coach. So, it could sound like it's an advertisement. I don't actually do that anymore, but I loved it so much. And I do feel like it gives you probably the best insight into what your customers need.
Oh, I could totally imagine. I'm no psychologist, but I always imagine like when you're in your own environment and you're in the situation where you're really using something and working, I think, at least for me, then it's a lot easier for me to flag any issues or feedback that I have versus when I'm on a call with someone and I'm trying to imagine what it's like to be in that situation or use it. So I think I haven't done it personally, but I think it sounds like a really great way to get intel.
There are a couple of questions that you can ask that help. Like if I just wanted to give people just a few tips, one of them is when you were last using the documentation, what did you look up? So very specific things so even if you've interviewed them, you're in a focus group, you're in some kind of situation that's outside of their work, you can get real data because it makes them think about the past and the mindset they were in and what they were looking for. That's usually a really good one. What's the last thing you looked up? Can you remember the last time you went to our website? What were you looking for? They can't always remember, but it's a place to start.
Of course. Yeah.
And if somebody says to you, you give them a design idea or something, and somebody says to you, yes, but they're really saying no. Those are probably, those are two pieces of advice I can give people for listening to users and learning how to hear what's really there.
Oh, that's funny. I'm American, so I always say, yeah, no. Yeah, that's always my cadence of speech. And it's always no if I say yeah, no.
Maybe it's because I'm a Southerner. I'm more likely to say, oh, yes, but.
It makes it sound sweeter. I like it. All right. So to close the Q&A session, I want to ask you a topic that is on everyone's mind, which is, who would the tech writer be in a folktale or fairy tale? Which archetype would us documentarians be?
Would us documentarians be in a folklore or a folk tale? Well, you could say that we're the bard telling the tale. That's one thing that, which is a reasonable thing. But if you want to think about, I'd say that we're probably most likely the fairy who makes everything happen. We're kind of the behind the scenes person making it all take place.
I love either of those options. Bard, fairy, I'll take both of them.
Somebody also wanted to know about the dragon, and here, I'll just show him.
Yes.
So he's got 4 legs, so I guess he's not technically a wyvern. Close, though. His name is Emerald, just so you know.
Oh my gosh. Well, I cannot think of a better note to end it on. That is amazing. If people have more questions for you, do you have a preferred way that they can get in touch?
Probably the easiest way to get hold of me is with my with an email. Or you can always get me on LinkedIn if we're connected, or I'll even answer people if we're not. But Towey@redhat.com. That'll work.
Amazing.
And apparently my talent acquisition guy has said to me, please tell everybody we're hiring, and we would love to have people come and talk to us. And I will say, unbidden, I love working at Red Hat. So.
Oh my gosh, this sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Ingrid, for being with us today. I appreciate it.